Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's September 18th, and we have a lot to talk about. I spent this past weekend attending the iConquer MS Leadership Summit in Boston. Now, iConquer MS is a people-powered research network. It's one of the foundational projects of the Accelerated Cure Project, and last March, I spoke with Dr. Robert McBurney, the CEO of the Accelerated Cure Project, and David Gwynne, who heads up their alliances and collaborations. We're going to revisit that conversation in just a few moments, but before we get to Robert McBurney and David Gwynne, there are a few other things that you should know about. In a shocking ruling in the United Kingdom, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence has issued a final decision that Ocrevus will not be made available as a treatment for primary progressive MS through the national healthcare system in England and Wales. Now, Ocrevus is the only medication that's been approved for treating primary progressive MS in the United States and throughout the European Union. So this is a particularly unfortunate decision for people living with primary progressive MS in the UK. And ironically enough, back in June, this same organization, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, approved Ocrevus for treating relapsing remitting MS in the UK. Well, the issue is price. And you might be wondering how the price of Ocrevus was acceptable for treating relapsing remitting MS, but not primary progressive MS. So stay with me for this bit of bureaucratic math. When they examined the clinical trial results for Ocrevus, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence determined that the trial results showing the benefit for people with primary progressive MS were not quite as compelling as the results showing the benefit for people with relapsing remitting MS. So in order for Ocrevus to be approved to treat primary progressive MS, the price would have to be lowered so that it met the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence cost-effectiveness threshold. And Roche, the manufacturer of Ocrevus, submitted a confidential discount price for using Ocrevus to treat primary progressive MS. It was a lower price than what they were charging the UK for Ocrevus to treat relapsing remitting. But the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence wasn't permitted to even consider this lower price, since they had already agreed to pay a set price for Ocrevus to treat relapsing remitting MS. So, to sum up, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence decided to withhold approval to treat primary progressive MS in the UK with Ocrevus because the price was too high. And they also decided that they couldn't consider accepting a lower price that was being offered by the drug's manufacturer. Now, that may not be the definition of insanity, but it points to a complete break with reality, a complete disconnect between the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence and the people living with primary progressive MS in the UK whom they serve. Well, the MS Society in the UK has launched an online petition requesting that the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence reconsiders this decision. And if you're listening to the podcast in the UK and you'd like to add your name to that petition, I'll include a link in today's show notes. Last year, Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals conducted an online survey titled Multiple Sclerosis in America, and they've just issued a report that highlights some of the findings from their survey. Well, 5,311 people participated in taking that survey, and the average participant was about 51 years old. 84.3% of the people who responded to the survey were female, and about 99% were Caucasian. Roughly 72% of the survey respondents were diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS, and about 3/4 of that group was using disease-modifying therapy. About 20% of the survey respondents reported having 2 MS relapses a year, and 2/3 of this group indicated that they were living with what they consider to be serious relapse symptoms. Now, one of the more interesting takeaways from this survey is that about 25% of the MS patients who were relapsing most often rarely, if ever, contacted their neurologist. And the reasons given most often for this failure to contact their healthcare provider was that they didn't find their healthcare provider to be helpful, and they didn't believe that their disease-modifying therapy, their MS prescription medication, was working. So it seems that there's an opportunity here to educate people living with MS about the value of staying in closer contact with their neurologist and staying on track with their prescription medication. There's plenty of scientific evidence that supports being on disease-modifying therapy, even when the outcome isn't readily available. We know that these medications can slow the progression of MS, and that can extend your quality of life. We also know that it's only through working with your neurologist that you can identify the treatment that's going to be most effective for you. Today, there are 14 different approved prescription treatments for relapsing remitting MS. The first one you try may not be the one that's going to work best for you. But writing off treatment as a failure is likely going to cause more harm than good in the long term. So all of this means that more, not less, communication with your neurologist can make a difference in ensuring that you're receiving the best possible treatment and living your best possible life. And as I've said before, I believe that as a patient, you have a responsibility here. You have an important part to play in treating your MS, and that's making sure that you're an informed medical consumer. And an informed medical consumer knows the value of disease-modifying therapy and appreciates the benefit of an ongoing dialogue with their neurologist. The more you can bring to your interactions with your neurologist, the more valuable and beneficial those interactions are going to be. If you'd like to read up on the detail of this survey, I'll include a link to the survey results in today's show notes. Can Do MS, in collaboration with the National MS Society here in the U.S., and the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada, is hosting a couple of worthwhile webinars, and I wanted to give you a heads up on what they're planning. On October 9th, they're presenting a webinar titled Multiple Sclerosis and Your Relationship to Food. And the webinar is going to be hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Mona Bostic and Dr. Gail Lewis. The webinar is going to explore the influence that diet has on your overall wellness while highlighting the emotional aspect of eating. Then on November 13th, they're presenting a webinar titled Communicating About Tough Topics, Caring for Others While Caring for Yourself. Well, November is National Caregivers Month, and this online workshop is designed to help support partners and people with MS communicate effectively in order to maintain a balanced relationship that allows us to care for others while caring for ourselves. And that in itself can be incredibly challenging at times. The webinar is going to feature a clinical psychologist and a couple living with MS, and the discussion will include specific strategies for communicating effectively about changing family roles, coping with mood issues, cognitive changes, and other troublesome MS symptoms, requesting and receiving help, and retaining and adapting shared interests. As someone who served as my wife's caregiver, I can assure you that these are important topics. They can sometimes be tough conversations, and this webinar sounds as though it will prepare you so that those conversations aren't quite so tough. You've heard it here before. knowledge is power. If you're interested in finding out more or registering for one or both of these webinars, I'll include a link in the show notes. I mentioned at the top of the podcast that I'm just back from spending 2 remarkable days at the iConquer MS Leadership Summit in Boston. Now, iConquer MS is a people-powered research network that gives you an opportunity to be a part of MS research, but in a new and incredibly empowering way. Instead of just asking people with MS to provide data, iConquer MS is driven by people living with MS, and it really serves as a bridge between people living with MS and the research community. That means that you not only get to contribute information, but you can suggest research topics that matter to you. It means that you'll receive updates on what researchers are learning from the patient-centered data that's being contributed to the iConquer MS community. iConquer MS represents a new paradigm of building collaborative partnerships to solve big healthcare questions and improve the quality of healthcare for everyone. And this past weekend, they brought together about 50 people from across the United States and beyond to talk about how transformational collaborations might impact every imaginable aspect of living with multiple sclerosis. The discussions were extraordinary, and staying true to their determination to put decision-making into the hands of the people who are affected by MS, every single discussion topic was created by one of the Leadership Summit attendees. There were discussions about the greater need for diversity and inclusion in the MS community, how age discrimination can keep people living with MS from receiving the disease-modifying therapy that they require, defining new ways to support and engage with caregivers, increasing patient participation through telemedicine, exploring single-payer healthcare, adjusting to the new normal of living with MS. These amazing topics led to deep discussions, which will lead to a patient-powered Next Steps committee that will determine how to best move these issues forward. It would be a complete understatement to just say that this was a high-powered, high-intensity couple of days. But thanks to the commitment of so many outstanding attendees, this Leadership Summit was so much more than a pop-up weekend event. It was a catalyst that created an agenda for change and an opportunity to move forward in important areas when it comes to how to best go about really living your best life with MS in all the ways that MS can touch your life. These are topics that I'll be watching and updating you on over the next several months. At the top of the podcast, I also mentioned that this past spring, I had a conversation with Dr. Robert McBurney, the CEO of the Accelerated Cure Project, and David Gwynne, who heads up their alliances and collaborations. In a moment, we're going to revisit that conversation. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then you know that I tend to be a bit of a science junkie. I can't help but feel hopeful when I hear about some of the amazing MS research that's going on in laboratories all around the world. I absolutely believe that research is going to one day unravel the mystery of MS, and even before that happens, I'm pretty confident that science is going to present us with better ways to manage MS so that it becomes something we can at least live with without giving up our quality of life. Well, there's an organization that I guess you could say is based on the very premise that research is the key to improving the outlook for people with MS. That organization is the Accelerated Cure Project for Multiple Sclerosis. And today my guests are Dr. Robert McBurney, the president and CEO of the Accelerated Cure Project, and David Gwynne, who's in charge of their alliances and collaborations. And I should probably add right now that I don't think that the word collaboration has more meaning in any organization than it does at the Accelerated Cure Project for MS. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, John.
Well, Robert, I thought maybe you could explain exactly what the Accelerated Cure Project for MS is all about.
Well, actually, thanks very much, John. Glad to be here with the opportunity to talk to you and be part of this podcast. Accelerated Cure Project actually is what you just introduced us as. We were founded back in 2001 by a high-tech entrepreneur in the Boston area, an engineer trained at MIT, who had been involved in the open source movement in software and hardware. And he probably hadn't thought very much about MS until the day he was diagnosed. And then he became convinced that there was an opportunity to make research go faster, very much along the principles that you mentioned at the beginning, that basically most medical advances have come out of research. And he wanted to make research go faster in multiple sclerosis, and he wanted to bring the principles of open science and sharing to the activity. And so he founded the Accelerated Cure Project not to do the research, not to fund the research, but to create assets that everybody needed and would make research go faster. And the first project, if you like, or program of Accelerated Cure Project was to create a biorepository of blood-derived samples like DNA and serum, and to associate them with lots of data, more data than I think anyone has ever collected about people with MS. And of course, this meant that we have to interact with people with MS through different clinical sites around the United States. And so really it's people with MS that made this resource possible, because not only did they donate their blood samples from which all of the materials were derived, but they donated a tremendous amount of data about themselves. And that resource today has been tremendous in supporting over 100 research projects worldwide, both in academia and industry. And there was one principle associated with that. And maybe this comes back to your mention of collaboration being at the heart. If a researcher, whether in academia or industry, received the DNA or other samples from the biorepository along with data, they agreed to return the data from their experiments back to a central database at a time which allowed them to decide whether there was any intellectual property that needed to be protected, etc. But the key is that this approach has essentially created a collaboration, a virtual collaboration between researchers all over the world, because all of their data has come back together. And our database probably knows more about MS. Note that I said the database probably knows more about MS, because one of the keys is to mine that database. But it probably knows more about MS than any other resource anywhere in the world.
That's just amazing. Now, the repository is certainly one of the key, probably best-known initiatives of the Accelerated Cure Project, but I know another major initiative is something called iConquer MS. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's what has been really remarkable is that back in 2013, there was an opportunity to gain funding from a new organization called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was established actually by the Affordable Care Act. Nothing to do with care or health insurance directly, but it was a very innovative idea to create a new institute that would focus much more on research from the point of view of patients. And as part of that initiative, there was an opportunity back in 2013 to apply for a contract to create what was referred to as a people-powered or patient-powered research network. And based upon our experience of building the asset, which was biosamples and data, we were successful in being awarded that contract. And so back in 2014, after the contract had been awarded, we went about creating a network that now, if you like, adds people into the assets. So people are available within that network. They agree to participate in research. They consent. They provide data about their symptoms, abilities, and quality of life. They also respond to ad hoc questions about particular research topics, and they're also able to suggest research topics that should be done in the network. And that network now represents about 4,400 plus people, growing every day. And if you like, it sort of completes the trifecta. The repository brings biosamples and data, and the iConquer MS initiative brings people and data all together to accelerate research in MS. And we need more research in MS.
Agreed. If people who are listening to the podcast today are interested in getting involved and participating in iConquer MS, is that something they can do?
Absolutely. And I'm really delighted that you're giving us the opportunity to make this known to the listeners to your podcast. You can join iConquer MS by going to a website, which is www.iconquerms, all as one word, .org, O-R-G. You can do this actually on your smartphone or on your computer or a tablet. You'll be asked to provide an email so your identity can be confirmed. You'll be sent an email that will allow you then to register and consent. And then there will be already some survey instruments that you can fill out related to your symptoms, ability, and quality of life. And also, you'll have an opportunity to suggest research topics. And probably in the next few weeks, you get an opportunity to respond to a particular question that was relevant to MS research or MS care.
I know that one of the more recent initiatives that you have already announced is something called the MS Minority Research Network. We actually talked a little bit about the study that was done under your auspices about minority participation in clinical trials in a previous podcast episode. But I'm wondering if you could fill us in on what the Minority Research Network is about.
Absolutely. So it's let's say well known, or maybe it isn't so well known, that most clinical trials that are involved in the development of a new medicine towards approval and then bringing it onto the market really do not capture in the clinical trial participants enough information, or do not capture enough participants who are from ethnic and racial groups or ethnic and racial minorities, who, in order to interpret the results of the clinical trials in a way that one would know whether there's a specific benefit to a specific racial or ethnic population in the trials. And this lack of sufficient numbers in the clinical trials also is reflected probably in clinical research generally. And so we made an application, again, back to PCORI, to put together a partnership of different groups to basically find out whether there were reservations about participating in research amongst different communities, and to come up with approaches to increase the participation in research of underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities. And so work has been going on for about the last 18 months. There's been a lot of new information discovered, And we're just at the point now where there are going to be some recommendations made and some actions taken to actually change the situation so that there's much more understanding and willingness and participation in MS research projects from different minority groups. And we're really excited about this because we probably don't know whether at the moment, whether there are specific treatment paradigms that would benefit, let's say, Hispanics or African Americans or Asians, because the data has never been adequately collected in the clinical trials, which are focused primarily upon Caucasian populations, not deliberately, but simply by lesser participation in the research project.
I'm personally happy to hear that we're going to be broadening the reach of our clinical trial populations so that they're a little more reflective, just for the very reasons you enumerated on. David, you have been very patient during our conversation, but one of the reasons I was glad that I'd have the chance to talk to you today was I know just a couple of weeks ago, Accelerated Cure Project announced a very exciting collaboration with the Regeneron Genetics Center. I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about what that collaboration is all about and what the benefit of that collaboration might be.
Right. What we announced was the Regeneron Genetics Center will actually take all of our repository samples, which include MS, related demyelinating disorders, as well as quote-unquote healthy controls, and they will generate DNA sequence data out of those samples for us, for them and us, and specifically exome sequence. Don't want to get too technical, but the exome part of our genome is the sort of 2 or 3% of our genome that actually encodes proteins, which basically build the physical aspects of our bodies and the functions of our bodies through enzymes and things like that. So this is an important addition to sort of the genetic repertoire. You probably recall that several years ago, actually over several years, the International Genetics MS Genetics group did what was called GWAS, which is another kind of genetic study, but sort of hits individual genes across the genome and looks at the differences and the correlations with disease. And this has been done in many diseases. This actually takes it. The study that we announced with RGC, Regeneron Genetics Center, will actually dive deeper into this realm, if you will, and actually generate full sequence data from the protein coding region of the genome. Our dream in the next step is to get complete genome sequence out of our samples, and indeed, we're sort of already probing that, starting that process, and trying to see who we can collaborate with to get that done.
So, is part of the hope that in sequencing the DNA, we're going to see patterns, similarities, commonly held traits amongst people who might be dealing with demyelinating disease?
Correct. Yes. MS and the related disorders is a complex. It's called polygenic disease. There are a number of genes involved, and we don't know the full picture yet. There are some blood diseases such as hemophilia involve often a single mutation in the entire genome that elicits the disease, whereas more complex diseases such as psychiatric disorders and MS and other neurodegenerative disorders it presents a more complex picture. So as I said, the big group that did the GWAS study some years ago identified, what is it, Robert? It's over 200 now, I think.
Yes.
Loci.
Yes.
Right.
Over 200. Yeah, over 200 genes, each of which is not very strongly associated with MS. Right.
So the importance of the exome is the fact that many of those so-called GWAS sites that were labeled and correlated with disease fall outside of the protein coding region. So this exome sequence data will allow us to take a much closer look at the protein coding region of the genome and hopefully expand what we know about the relationship between genes and disease, in this case, in MS.
If I could just add into that, I think that the big international MS genetics consortium activity, the information they had about the sources of the DNA were simply that people had MS. And of course, the result of that was lots of genes with weak associations with that single characteristic. If you think about what we're doing with Regeneron and think about the repository, our repository has tremendous breadth of information about the history of people before they have MS, the characteristics of their MS, and what treatments they're on, what exposures they've had to toxins, etc. And I think that this is what we refer to as deep phenotyping. And the thing that's going to be really exciting about bringing together this genomic information with deep phenotyping is I think that we might be able to find patterns that where specific subgroups of genes associate with specific characteristics of people with MS. And I think that's a tremendous hope here because, frankly, what we do know is that MS is a highly variable disease, but we don't know at the moment whether there are, nuanced subclasses of MS. We use the terms like relapsing, remitting, secondary progressive, or primary progressive, but we don't have many nuanced ways of looking at people with MS. And we also know that many people don't respond to the MS medications in a positive way. And that's the reason that there's a lot of trial, very sad and some very disappointing trial and error movement of people from one disease-modifying therapy to another. And the hope is here that by bringing together this deeper genomics with deeper phenotyping, we may be able to determine that there are a number of different subclasses of MS that are determined by genetics and interaction with the environment, and that maybe those subclasses will respond more predictably to certain medications. So I think it's a very exciting thing for our samples, which have deep phenotyping associated with them, to be subjected to deep genotyping as well.
John, I should also mention, Robert just referred to the deep phenotyping. We also announced recently a collaboration with BC Platforms, which is a group based in Scandinavia that not only sort of hosts and curates data, but also provides the possibility of deeper analysis. And we've already uploaded our phenotype data and some of the genetics data from the big genetic study that was done on our samples. And indeed, this new exome data, when it's available, will also go into that database and provide researchers and indeed folks in our own organization the opportunity to do these analyses that Robert referred to. And the next step in all of this is a deeper transcriptome analysis, which you're probably aware of, that the way genes are expressed is also important and can provide even further detail, further insight into the cause of diseases.
And I guess, although it's quite separate and there isn't a connection today and probably not for a little while, but while all this work is going on, the technology that's driving gene editing is becoming more and more sophisticated. And frankly, as it becomes more sophisticated, it becomes more simple and much faster to accomplish.
CRISPR-Cas9 is a great example, is what you're probably referring to. But
exactly. And I'm thinking that the more we understand the genome behind MS and we get that equation fully expressed and understood, it provides other opportunities for other kinds of intervention besides just medicine. Could very well be in this realm of gene editing, where and I realize now I introduced myself as a science junkie, and now it's true. But I think that there may be something down the road where those paths could cross.
Perhaps, yes.
And the other side of that, John, is some of the things that we're finding out about symptoms, abilities, and quality of life for people with MS through the iConquer MS community. And I think that the approach that brings together interventions that people can do today, together with their genome and their background, as well as perhaps the future of gene editing and things like that. I think there's a tremendous promise here, which we feel we're really delighted to be part of. Because, as I said, we don't fund the research, we don't do the research, but we provide resources that can make this research go faster.
And I know that providing all those resources certainly takes a fair amount of overhead. I know that the Accelerated Cure Project is a nonprofit organization. If someone is listening right now and is as excited about some of the work that you are shepherding as I am, how can they go ahead and donate toward the Accelerated Cure Project?
So on the Accelerated Cure Project website, there's a Donate Now button. But that's a very passive way to make donations. We're delighted with that way. But if someone is really excited about what we're doing and wants to learn more, they can. There's an info at Accelerated Cure Project email that you can send things, or alternatively just phone the organization and ask to speak to me or someone else. My email is rMcBurney, RMCBURNEY @acceleratedcure.org. And I'd be happy to talk with folks that are really interested in the organization. And, there are so many different ways that people can contribute. Obviously, as you say, we're a nonprofit, and nonprofits usually are struggling hand to mouth with funding. But donating data, donating biosamples when we come around to ask for them. These types of donations, donating your opinions when we send out a specific survey or question. These are all tremendously important donations, but I wouldn't overlook the importance of financial contributions as well. But there are many ways to donate to Accelerated Cure Project, and also you can sign up for newsletters from Accelerated Cure Project, and the newsletters come out about once a month. They have interesting topics on them. Some topics about Accelerated Cure Project or iConquer MS, and some topics about MS generally. And so there are many ways that people can get involved with Accelerated Cure Project. But again, I say I wouldn't overlook financial contributions because they're tremendously important to our sustainability.
Robert and David, let me thank you both. I appreciate you spending a little bit of time taking us through what the Accelerated Cure Project is all about and some of the just amazing projects that you guys are putting together and shepherding forward. So thanks for being on the podcast today.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you might want to do that. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.